Today, we're going to take a look at the deep relationship between the Nazi Party and Mercedes, and how Adolf Hitler significantly changed the direction of the company. Even today, cars are often used as a status symbol. Being seen driving certain cars does bring about connotations of success, even if the reality couldn't be further from the truth. It's all too common in the UK that a man in his late 20s will finance a car to impress others, putting themselves deep into debt just to show off. This isn't a recent phenomenon though. In fact, Adolf Hitler used cars in a very similar way to mould the image of the Nazi Party into one of success and abundance. Cars weren't the only element meticulously crafted to influence the German public, but it certainly played a big role. Mercedes were the perfect car to be seen in at the time. German-made and engineered, luxurious and expensive. They represented both Germany's capability and the owner's success at the same time, and Hitler knew that. He had an in with Mercedes thanks to an acquaintance by the name of Jakob Verlin. He was an Austrian car salesman with whom Hitler had become acquainted with in 1923, shortly before his imprisonment. Jakob began working for the Benz motor company in 1921 in Munich. The rest of the history from there is riddled with contradictions and inaccuracies, but here's the closest report of the events I can put together. Hitler's first car was a Selv, a car from a lesser-known German manufacturer which has long been defunct. In the 1920s, he had a green Selv 620, which he was driven around in by Julius Schorb. The company died off in 1929 in the middle of the economic crisis that year. Hitler never really drove his own cars. He didn't have a license and decided that being seen being driven around would be good for his image anyway. Speaking of image, the Selv wasn't doing it for him, and before long he had his eye on a Mercedes to replace it. Less than a year later, the Selv was replaced with a Mercedes that was financed by the party's deep pockets, paired with a good relationship to car dealers. Whilst imprisoned in Landsberg, a young Adolf Hitler wrote a letter to Jakob Verlin, who was an associate director for Mercedes-Benz. In the letter addressed to Jakob, dated from the 13th of September 1924, Hitler wrote the following. Dear Mr. Verlin, after reflecting upon our conversation today, I would like to ask you, dear Mr. Verlin, to perhaps intercede me in two ways. Generally, I'm convinced that an 1140 would suit my present needs. The only thing that is perhaps influencing me is the fact that it runs 300 rotations faster than the 1650. I would be grateful if you could let me know in your next letter whether you think an RPM of 250 isn't so high that a car might suffer in the short run. As I said, this is the only thing that makes me cautious about the 1140 because I will not be able to afford a new car in 2 or 3 years, and I cannot take the time every few years to find better, more lucrative work. However, I would like to ask you to perhaps also inquire into what kind of a rebate I would get with either a 1650 or a 1140. Also, whether there is an 1140 available in grey with wire spoke wheels. The difficulty for me, of course, is that even in the case of my release on the 1st of October, larger revenues from my book will not be available until mid-December, so I am forced to ask for an advance or loan. It goes without saying that several thousand marks make a difference, as I also have to pay my court and legal costs immediately, which are already making my hair stand on end. Thus, I sincerely ask that you put in a good word for me, since my chance of a purchase generally depends on it. In any event, I would like to ask you to reserve the grey car you have in Munich until I have clarity regarding my fate. I will let you know immediately whether I will be released in October and whether I will be able to buy a car. Yours most respectfully, Adolf Hitler. It's assumed that they managed to work something out because after Hitler's release, Verlin is said to have picked him up from the prison gates in a new Mercedes. Hitler got his car, although there's a pretty good chance his questionable personal finances weren't enough to cover the payments, so the party likely got involved and helped him out with it. Verlin and Hitler's bond grew stronger over time, and it's reported that Verlin would often visit Hitler's Alpine home and would often give Nazi officials very significant discounts on their cars. Over the following years, the Nazi Party continued growing the size of their fleet of Mercedes to be paraded around in as the party and finances grew. Years later, Hitler's love for Mercedes grew stronger than ever. On the 13th of March 1930, a large truck hit his car. The truck shoved the car 20 meters before finally coming to a stop when they bumped into a curb. This could easily have been a fatal crash for Hitler. Instead of putting his survival of the crash down to fate or luck, he immediately attributed it to the Mercedes. "The other car was totally wrecked," he said. "On mine, only the bumpers and running board were damaged. It was then I decided to use only a Mercedes for the rest of my life," said Hitler. Hitler continued to own and adore Mercedes for the following years. They were the perfect car for the Nazi Party. They carried a level of prestige and luxury which drew thoughts of prosperity. Mercedes were also German, of course, and presented Germany as being technologically advanced to the rest of the world. They were also prohibitively expensive, which played into the Nazis' rigid thoughts on hierarchy throughout society. Finally, the company also actively supported the Nazi Party back, so they had a good relationship with each other. Hitler became a shareholder in the company, likely thanks to Jakob Verlin, as a way into the company. With his own skin in the game, he then handed huge military contracts over to them in the early 30s. Mercedes was instrumental in the build-up of German armaments in the lead-up to the Second World War. As the leading manufacturer of armaments, they built trucks, rocket parts, tanks, and aeroplane motors, to name a few. Daimler-Benz increased their workforce in order to ramp up their production, with all walks of life being thrown at their factories. Foreign workers and concentration camp inmates were among those involved. But it wasn't just the military they were involved in the 1930s. The 1932 Grand Prix in Berlin was won by Manfred von Brauchitsch in a Mercedes-Benz SSKL. After this, Hitler realized the potential motor racing had in demonstrating Germany's power to the world, and it's unsurprising looking back. The SSKL looked absolutely light years ahead of the other cars at the time, and helped to cement the idea of Germany's technology being at the forefront. At the time, German morale was at an all-time low, so this reminded the nation what they were capable of. Hitler quickly realized that this morale boost and increased patriotism was a powerful tool, which he could harness to build Germany's power. Using racing to demonstrate the strength of Germany became increasingly important over time. One of the most important and despicable men at the top of the Nazi Party alongside Adolf was Joseph Goebbels. He fully supported the idea of using motorsport as a way to boost the nation's ego and bring Germany together at the same time. According to Jim Weisman, the writer and director of Hitler's Supercars, Goebbels really took motorsport and shaped it into an enthusiast sport that the nation could really get behind. As soon as the penny dropped, the domination began. Germany powered through racing in the 1930s with a combination of stellar engineering and world-class drivers.